Hi, everyone.
Hi.
I'm V. Sanchez. I look like a short brown lady with long black hair, and I'm going to be delivering a message today. It's called Connecting in the Underground, and it's just going to talk about stories of resistance, resilience, and transformation. So to quote Adrienne Marie Brown, the author of Emergent Strategy, we're living in impossible times. If it were fiction, it would be critiqued as hyperbolic. If it were a nightmare, we would never sleep. As societal and political forces escalate to limit access to the ballot, to education, to healthcare, housing, and all the bedrocks we need for healthy living, we must lean into our capacity to resist. But what does it mean to resist? Some examples of resistance exist in nature and things all around us in everyday activities. Resistance can be found in electricity. It's what causes light to come from a light bulb, what causes your toaster to toast bread, and what causes your electric oven to cook food. Resistance can also bring strength. It works in the gym. Resistance builds muscles. Resistance helps to start campfires by rubbing two sticks together, and much bigger fires with a lot more sticks. Resistance sharpen, like the whetstone that sharpens knives. These examples in nature are also parallel in people's struggles. Not surprisingly, since we are part of nature. Resistance brings underground struggles to the surface. In organizing, wielding and exercising power builds more power. Those seeking racial justice didn't sing, "We shall get along." They sang, "We shall overcome." Those resistance movements, Black people have achieved triumph, success, and progress, as seen in the end of chattel slavery, dismantling of Jim and Jane Crow segregation in the South, increased political representation in all levels of government, desegregation of educational institutions, and the passage of Civil Rights Act in 1964, among so many other wins. Black resistance strategies have served as a model for every other social movement in this country. Thus, the legacy and importance of these actions really just can't be overstated enough. In the 1950s and the 60s and 70s, the US was defined by acts of resistance, such as sit-ins, boycotts, walkouts, strikes by Black people and their co-conspirators of all colors in the fight for racial justice against discrimination in all sectors of society, from employment to education to housing. Historically, we've had to consistently push the US to live up to its ideals of freedom, liberty, and justice for all, and that still rings true today. Now, I'm going to pivot a little bit in the area that I work in. I'll be speaking about resistance through the lens of housing injustice, and the landless movement. All over the US, rising costs are flaring into pockets of resistance and rage. Take 2+ years of pandemic-fueled eviction anxiety and spiking home prices and growing inflation that is increasingly driven by rising rents, and throw in a long run of an affordable housing shortage that, our cities seemingly are powerless, though I don't truly believe that, but not to go too off track. And that's added up to 44 million US households who rent a home or apartment and have many, many reasons to be unhappy and unstable. And that unhappiness extends across all economic spectrums. At one end, you have tenants who aspire to buy a home. Home ownership has long been like the American dream for many, since the beginning, probably. And that is increasingly not achievable for so many more of us. We're having our hopes dashed by these high prices and now rising mortgage rates. And at the other end of the spectrum are low-income tenants who make up the bulk of 11 million households who spend more than half of our income in just rent. In between this is basically a hollowed out middle class that is steadily losing ground, although not enough to qualify for much sympathy or help. The confluence of all of these forces has fueled a swell of tenant rights activism and resistance that has brought organizing muscles and policies like rent control and housing co-ops to cities across the country. In Springfield, a city with over 60% of us are tenants, where 1 in 5 residents live in poverty, where full-time minimum wage workers have to work 64 hours a week just to afford the average 2-bedroom apartment in this city. Tenant activism has become alive. 3 in 5 Springfield residents are tenants, the majority of us who are poor or working class. And our bid to resist the status quo and challenge the narrative that rents must just always continue to go up, and that poor people don't have a right to safe, accessible, livable homes if they can't afford it. In 2020, after being laid off from work and stuck at home with 2 kids during the pandemic, the start of the pandemic, I was being harassed about paying rent, and I didn't have the money, and I knew I wasn't going to be able to get the money. And then I realized that the same thing was happening with my neighbors and my friends. And I don't know what the people demanding rent were expecting, that the poor and hungry people would dissipate, that we would go hide our shame, that we would leave our homes without a fuss. Well, we said, hell no. We said, Springfield tenants ain't playing, and our homes were staying. Yep. So tenants got together and won an allocation of $8 million from the city of Springfield to go towards rental assistance, which was originally slated to go to a business loan funding program and a contingency fund, right? So resistance is safety, and resistance in number especially. Through this, we learned that while we won, charity and temporary funding was not going to be enough to challenge the system fundamentally. We knew that as long as housing was commodified, homelessness and the risk of it would persist. During the onset of the pandemic, when these mass layoffs and evictions were at their height, the choice to found Springfield Tenants Unite was a simple one. The people closest to the problem were the people closest to the solution. So what we needed to do was build an organization that expressed both the power and the expertise of the people whose lives had actually been impacted by housing insecurity. Our long-term goal was to build a powerful organization of working class tenants that could reshape the balance of power between tenants and the for-profit housing lobby. We knew that getting rental assistance was not going to be enough to ensure that every person has a safe, accessible, truly, and permanently affordable home. We knew that we needed to look beyond the current crisis. During that time, I became uncomfortably clear about something. Nothing was ever going to change. Nothing was ever going to get better just because I was running around town with some interesting data and well-designed PowerPoint decks. The only way things were going to change was if the people who were most impacted by the problems, eviction, poor housing conditions, landlord harassment, etc., were organized to the table and to flip the table over and to determine our own liberation. I met people like Darlene Steele, a tenant leader who was experiencing homelessness, who told me her vision for a better world. I talked to people like Alice Barber, a tenant who knew that we all deserved more, who asked questions like, what if we got well? During our first meetings, there was just this clarifying moment of, we're not okay, people are not okay, we are struggling, and no one knows. And the more of us who tell our story, the more of us realize that our story is worth being told. Embedded in tenant organizing are deeper questions about the structure of our political economy. It's gotten people to think about not just how you can leverage power against your landlord or to get the city council to help you, but also questions like, why does the economy seem to be rigged against people like you and I so systematically? Following the leadership of marginalized tenants and unhoused folks, I do my part to build power towards our radical imagination about what is possible, and we're ready to fight for it. And I'll be ending this message about resistance with one of my favorite poems. It's called Interlocking Roots by Naima Penniman. When Hurricane Katrina slammed into the Gulf Coast, almost everything lost its footing. Houses were detached from their foundations. Trees and shrubbery were uprooted. Signs, posts, and vehicles floated down the river that became of the streets. But amidst the whipping winds and surging water, the oak tree held its ground. How? Instead of digging its roots deep and solitary into the earth, the oak tree grows its roots wide and interlocks with other oak trees in the surrounding area. And you can't bring down 100 oak trees bound beneath the soil. How do we survive the unnatural disasters of climate change, environmental justice, over-policing, mass imprisonment, militarization, economic inequality, corporate globalization, and displacement? We must connect in the underground, my people. This way we shall survive.